Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. Great to be here.
Aaron, let's start with a bit about your background. How did you first get interested in the type of work you're doing today?
I've had kind of a journey to get to what maybe we would call the next economy, solidarity economy space. After college or during college, I got really concerned about the prison system. It was something that I grew up in the East Bay in California, and I was a fairly privileged middle-class person, but saw the ways in which, particularly like the policing and incarceration of young people of color, was sort of ravaging communities. And it was just sort of an inquiry in my head. And when I went to college, we started studying it. And after leaving school, I moved to Boston for school. And after college, had the opportunity to start organizing. I was the co-founder of the organization called the Boston Workers Alliance. And we were, a traditional grassroots community organization that was driving policy campaigns. Our folks were people who had criminal records, some people coming out of prison, some people who were charged but never convicted, but nonetheless, all of them were facing this racialized barrier to employment. And we saw this like deep crisis of joblessness in the community. And so our work was to sort of help people see that their unemployment was not just a function of their life choices, but it was actually a systemic injustice. That's kind of the premise for community organizing, is helping people see that the things that they're facing is not just an individual problem, but is actually a structural injustice. And so we really started digging into policy strategies around trying to remove barriers to employment. And we were really successful in helping build a statewide coalition of organizations in Massachusetts that helped ban the box, which is removing that question from job applications that were keeping so many people from even being able to be considered seriously. And it was amazing work. Like our members, told their stories, helped humanize what people otherwise saw as just criminals. And, when we started the campaign, it was a 5-year campaign. People were like, that's crazy. Like, you want to try to help get people with criminal records get a job? Like, I can't even get a job. Why would we do that? But by the end of the 5-year campaign, we had helped sort of shift the dialogue from being tough on crime to being smart on crime, and helping people sort of see the structural underlying economic problems that were creating poverty and sort of perpetuating recidivism, all these things. So, I come out of a very traditional grassroots social movement organizing sector. But as we were doing this work, our members, even as we passed this policy, like our members were still having trouble finding jobs. And what we were sort of coming to terms with was the fact that, like, even as you remove barriers, there still was a structural problem with employment opportunities. And so our members started talking about whether we can start building our own businesses. And this was sort of during the era of sort of the rise of the green job sector. All the federal money was coming down for energy efficiency. And actually we took a bunch of members down to Green for All's founding conference in Memphis, Tennessee. And people got really excited about the prospects of creating, green jobs strong enough to lift people out of poverty. And we had already been exploring worker ownership as a strategy, but that really sort of helped catalyze the thinking about, like, not only do we want to build our own businesses, but we actually want to, if we're a worker justice organization, we don't want to replicate the same sort of extractive and exploitative dynamics that so many of our members who were able to find work were facing. And so, kind of the perspective was like, we're working so hard to integrate into a burning building, to sort of hearken Malcolm X, like, instead, can we think about building our own house? And so really that led me to this question on what would it take for us to start not just building cooperative economies, but rooting those strategies in communities of color, in working class communities that, as we know, like historically have held mutual aid, cooperativism, all these core strategies for survival. But I think in the last 30 plus years, we've seen sort of this like bifurcation between what's seen as community organizing and what's seen as sort of cooperative economic development. Although we know that, like, a lot of the history of the Black liberation movement, for example, like held these two things together. But I do think we started to notice that, like, hey, we're doing community organizing, but like, we're not just political people, we're economic people, we're cultural people, and we feel that we're not able to be our whole selves. And so what was really exciting was moving beyond the oppositional politics that we were driving and needing to continue to hold, and actually asking the question of what are we trying to build. And so worker ownership was one small piece of that. And I would love to look back to that because I learned a lot about how challenging it is to move financing and sort of the lack of kind of knowledge that our community organizing sector had around finance and business. But one other piece was we found ourselves also every year in Boston, there's like a day in which young people come in, like thousands of young people come in March, demanding for an increase in funding for youth jobs. And it was a situation where like it's a beautiful moment where like young folks are expressing their demands and calling on the government to do their job. But it was also really frustrating to see the same thing every year. It almost became this like annual theater. And for us, the question became like, how do we get out of this hamster wheel that we're in so that we can move one step upstream and actually control the budgeting process ourselves? And so our members, when we went to the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit, got to learn about participatory budgeting, which had recently come into Chicago. And so that was another sort of campaign that we were driving around the time that I left the Boston Workers Alliance. And when I left, it was another campaign that we actually won. And so the mayor initiated a citywide youth-only participatory budgeting process where young people were able to allocate $1 million out of the budget. And one of the jobs I took on after leaving the Workers Alliance was being the lead organizer. I was subcontracted with the participatory budgeting project to help sort of implement and design this process. And so for us, like, there are a few different threads around how do we think about controlling labor and workplaces in a different way, but also how do we think about controlling municipal governance and sort of the role of the public sector more broadly. And a lot of this then sort of took me towards really trying to investigate, like, again, moving further upstream. And so I guess, just to back up a second, for me, like, a lot of us have anti-capitalist politics, but when I was at the Boston Workers Alliance and sort of doing community organizing, I was finding that like we weren't actually articulating this vision. And if we're the people who are getting like so privileged to get paid to do this work, we're not even articulating the truth. Like I started to ask, like, why is it that we don't talk about this? And I think like one of the reasons is people were afraid of sounding too radical and alienating our funders, and that's a real problem in the nonprofit system. But actually, I think it was one step deeper. It's really that we didn't know what the alternative would be. So if I'm working with community folks who are struggling just to stay in their homes or trying to stay out of jail or find a job, it's not super useful to talk about like the broad sweeps of destructive capitalism when we don't have sort of a solution or a pathway to get out of it. And so for me, like the worker ownership piece was like a glimpse into the possibility of what a post-capitalist workplace could look like, one in which we don't have wage labor relations, that people own the products of their own labor, right? Like the participatory governance of budgeting was another piece. And for me, like, I just started to see how clearly that like we had to talk about capitalism, because even going back to the issue of the criminal record piece, right? Like what I started to understand as I started to study more about the history of neoliberalism in this country was seeing how, this country was built on the extracted and exploited labor, particularly of Black people, and from the theft and genocide of indigenous people and the stealing of land. What became really clear to me was like there was a major shift in the early 1970s where the capitalist class no longer found or needed the labor of particularly Black Americans, particularly young men of color, who were so important to sort of building the infrastructure and creating the wealth. And it's basically like as the civil rights movement won the victories that it did, and we had to end this sort of official apartheid economy that we're existing in, rather than integrating and paying people the same that they were paying white people. Instead, they chose to find cheaper labor abroad, right? And that was just sort of the deindustrialization and globalization. And what that meant for our communities was that now, for the first time in American history, the labor that was was extracted to build the wealth that we have was no longer necessary, and the sort of economy and the political system pivots towards actually containment and sort of seeing young people and people of color as surplus labor, no longer necessary. So we don't even need policing to extract labor from them. Policing shifts to a function of actually containing and invisibilizing, right? And so for me, like whatever issue that we're dealing in, whether it's the ecological devastation that comes from the profit motive that's driving us towards the precipice of self-destruction as we know it, the deep racial wealth divide, the need for militarization and neocolonialism to extract resources from other countries, or even the exploitation of women, like the very foundation of capitalism when we transitioned from feudalism to capitalism was actually forcing women, in Europe, like, so I don't know if you're familiar with sort of the history of witches and witch persecution, but a lot of that was actually taming and forcing women to take a new function in the economy as basically being in the home, sort of this white Christian femininity that really was about requiring free reproductive labor that then enabled men to go work in factories, for example, right? And that's an oversimplification, but like all these different pieces that we're all working on, across organizations, across issues, like we're rooted at one level at this intersection of patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. And so for me, like, if we're not talking about this, and I'm committed to doing this work for the rest of my life, like, but it's hard, and I don't want to be working on something that isn't going to, at least, I would rather work and fail, but at least going towards something that I think is a solution than sort of spinning and making incremental reforms that I know aren't true solutions. And so for me, like, the kind of place, and that was a long way of getting here, but like the Center for Economic Democracy and my prior work with the Boston Impact Initiative, doing direct impact investing and helping build Ujima and a number of other projects were all oriented around this question of like, how do we actually help people see what the possibility for alternatives could be? And I really led the Hold Up movement generation. I know you had both on Michelle on your podcast a while ago. Like, they have this beautiful quote that the heart learns what the hands do. And so going back to this question of what is the alternative, my feeling was until we actually allow for our own communities to start building the solutions and building the muscles for economic self-governance, we're never going to then be able to sort of turn the corner to make a cultural tide that shifts how we think about our role in the economy. And, just to take even one step below that, for me, like, a lot of this work is really about a struggle for defining the very nature of humanity. One of my mentors, Emily Kawano, who is with the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, often talks about sort of the premise of capitalism as being one of this conception of the homo economicus, right? A self-interested, rational actor. And that was sort of the premise upon which so much of economic theory has been built. And we know that that is a feature of human nature, sure, but it's definitely not the only part of us. And part of what makes humans human is like the social aspect of our ability to be in community and make meaning together, right? And so for me, like, if we believe that we are more than self-interested actors, and actually taking a step even below that, if we believe, just to quote my friend Alandria, who was at the Highlander Center for a long time, like, if we believe that we're truly divine people, right, then like, what are the rights that divine people have, right? We have the right to collectively self-determine. That the very idea of someone extracting our labor or making decisions on our behalf is a violation of the very dignity that we have as people. So for me, like, in a simple way, the way we talk about it is like, we believe that people can make decisions for themselves, so we can collectively govern. We don't need politicians and CEOs who have really driven us into this crisis that we're in now to make decisions for us. And so that's really sort of the underlying premise and the motivation for economic democracy, next economy, new economy, as we talk about it.
This is why I love talking to you, Aaron, because the depth and information that you carry, and I love your work because you don't just like, you're not just like reading textbooks from like the library and like citing stuff. You're actually like creating the projects in the real world. So that's, like Boston Ujima and Center for Economic Democracy. And there's another piece that I notice that I think is important for listeners, which is when I hear you speak and when some of us speak, especially when like in talking about things like white supremacy and like, genocide of indigenous folks and, chattel slavery, it's like, I think sometimes people feel like guilty or scared, or especially like white people are like, oh my gosh, there's like this history. And it's like, I think but I think the way that most of us have been living is just sort of like not acknowledging it. And so we're sort of continually creating more problems. I think it's actually empowering and like in a weird way, is like positive to like name and know those things and also be like keeping that in mind. So it's like when I hear you speak, I'm not like depressed about like what's happened and like the history. I think it's really important and it's heavy stuff and like we have to keep it. But I think like what you're doing is really important, which is like holding it and then like creating solutions from that space of knowledge.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, for me, like we have so much like unnecessary pain and suffering in this world. And for me, a lot of this work was trying to understand like why do we do this to each other? And it's led me down this path of like understanding the historical context. But I think it's right, because part of it is like we inherited the world that we live in, right? Like you or I didn't choose to live in a United States that was a settler colonial state directly, or at least in a sort of literal sense. Like we didn't necessarily, like we were born into the world that we exist, and so like we have to take responsibility for our actions in this world. But if we don't understand where we're coming from, it's hard to sort of make sense. And then it's very easy to feel lost, right? But if we can say like, look, like even capitalism, an idea that feels so big, we could start to understand the transition from feudalism to capitalism and how that happened. And that, capitalism between 300 and 500 years old, depending on how you cut it, like it's not a permanent, invariable fixture of human existence. It's a construct of people. And so from that standpoint, like, yeah, for us to be able to make the changes we need, we have to acknowledge the decisions that were made before us. And I think, like Amaka Agbo's work, she was on your podcast also, and she's sort of been talking about the restorative economics, right? Like that for me is sort of holding this repertory frame, but not doing it in a way that's simply just pointing at fingers and saying that you should feel bad about yourself, but actually creating a pathway for true restoration, recognizing the benefits that people with privilege, as a cis man, East Asian person, I'm a person of color, but I'm very privileged in context. And that helps me like understanding the benefits that I carry. Like, I slip up all the time, I think, but that cognizance helps guide the work that I'm doing, and keeps me from feeling that I'm just like an individual actor, sort of like spinning on my own, but actually that I'm part of this legacy of struggle, right? That as we start to understand the history of domination, we also understand the history of struggle and resistance. And so, I feel like we don't give ourselves a space to sort of look at the big picture often, and we just sort of see ourselves in this current moment. And I think it's necessary for us to be able to see into the future. First, we have to look into the past.
Let's talk a bit about capitalism, and especially like how the financial markets and just, I'd love your thoughts on alternatives to capitalism and, what you've been seeing, or why, maybe sort of a corollary question is like, why focus on capital in like a lot of your work? That's a question for you.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say that I focus on capital, although I do focus on capital, but, I started with this question first at labor. And so like, I started to see, worker ownership as a model for non-extractive workplaces, again, where someone isn't paying you a wage and then taking all the rest of the profit. Like that's already a model that pivots sort of one of the key logics of capitalism, which is wage labor extraction, right? And then we saw the history of community land trusts. I'm based in Boston, and we have the W Street Neighborhood Initiative. We have the Schumacher Center in Western Mass. And like, that's a model of holding land in collective control, taking it out of the speculative market, decommodifying land, and actually allowing communities to decide how they want to use land to meet their own needs, right? And so if you think about any economy, whether it's a capitalist economy or any else, you have core inputs that allow us to produce things and consume things and meet our own needs. And that's labor is one of them. The land, both like the literal real estate, but of course the bounty of the living earth, the natural resources that we then work with to create value. And so anyway, I was starting to see that there was already these models for sort of a non-capitalist approach to labor and land. But what for me was missing the most was sort of that application towards capital, which is a third piece that you need in any economy. You need infrastructure, and you need money, at least in this current, instantiation of economy. And for me, the question was like, well, what would it look like to actually democratize capital? And part of that is because I was starting to see, like, as we were building worker-owned cooperatives, like one of the biggest barriers, of course, or like trying to acquire land for community land trusts, one of the biggest barriers was access to capital, but also the conditions and terms that capital place on who capital invests in, right? And as you've talked about extensively, like capital in a capitalist economy is about extraction and accumulation, And so for me, the question became, we still need capital, but like, how do we rethink the function, the governance? And it was a journey for me to get to where we are now. And I want to really acknowledge the Boston Impact Initiative, which was one of the jobs or organizations that I got to work with after I left the Boston Workers Alliance. So actually, like when I was leaving the Workers Alliance, we were actually starting our first sort of small green businesses failed, and then we were sort of doing a second version, which has come to be known as Sero Co-op, which is a organic waste composting business. But we didn't really know how to finance these things, and so I had kind of just the fortune of meeting Deborah Fries, who was also on your podcast. She was the founder of the Boston Impact Initiative, and she hired me to be their first employee. I was a startup manager, and so that was really eye-opening in and of itself to sort of see how finance capital, because I do think as like social justice movement folks, like we have such a deep aversion to finance because of the violence that it's inflicted on our communities historically. But I started to see with BII, one of the first deals we did was partnering with the Co-op Fund of New England, doing a $20,000 zero interest unsecured loan to this co-op that was coming out of our communities and was aligned with the social justice movement sector, right? And at BII, we were also able to start financing community land trusts, for example. So the function of capital, I started to see as a obvious and essential piece to helping build the solidarity economy as alternatives to capitalism, and started to ask the question, like, I come out of a community organizing framework where our theory of change is that we build collective power amongst oppressed or frontline communities, right? And that people have the knowledge and the wisdom and the expertise to build their own solutions. So for me, the question became, if that's my theory of change, and meanwhile, I was also running this, helping run this citywide participatory budgeting process where I see these young folks, like on the day of voting when they're choosing between projects, it was really cool to watch them debating about like, oh, should we vote for this like one big project that would be sort of a citywide thing, or should we be voting on the little projects so that everyone gets something in their neighborhood? And just like, of course, like young people have genius inside of them and they can govern, right? But like, so if that's kind of a foundational theory for me, the question became like, how do we apply that ethic and that theory to the allocation of capital? And so not only is it about what we're investing in, nor even just the terms, but I started to ask like, well, who gets to make these decisions in the first place? And so that's sort of what helped us, moved us towards building the Boston Ujima Project, which is, and I'm excited that you're going to have, I think, me and some other folks on the team in a future podcast or maybe prior, depending on when these air, but which is our attempt at sort of modeling a democratically governed investment vehicle in Boston that's governed and controlled predominantly by working class people of color. And it's really in a simple way, like Ujima is taking a crowdsourced impact investing fund and then applying participatory budgeting processes for the allocation, right? And so what's important about that is like, we already have crowdsourcing, for example. So if you're a millionaire, then you can crowdsource something and you have much bigger impact than someone who has $50 to invest. But in Ujima, what we're able to do is actually pool our money. So whether you put in $50 or you put in $10,000, everyone has an equal vote, right? And that for me is fundamental, because part of the pathology of capitalism is that capital serves the interests of the capital holders, which means that if you're wealthy and you can invest, then you can invest in whatever it is that you happen to want to invest in, whether it's exploitative or it's regenerative. But it's ultimately your choice, right? Whereas for us, we believe that actually not only is it a violation of our dignity, but it's also a better way of making decisions to sort of tap into the wisdom and the knowledge that communities have about what they need, what's going to work in their own place, and actually empowering people to make these decisions. And so, for me, like the Ujima Project is like a really, it's been like 3.5 years for us to get to where we are. And we just launched the fund actually in December. 2 years ago, we launched as a membership organization. We have over 400 members. In December, we launched the fund. And right now, I guess we're in early March, still before 100 days, and we just about to cross the $500,000 raise and 100 investor threshold that we've been striving for. And so it's really, really exciting. And like, we're pretty clear that, Ujima is both a meaningful piece of infrastructure in Boston, particularly for like, and I should also mention that Ujima was like sort of co-conceived with an organization called City Life Vida Urbana, which is one of our strongest housing justice organizations, the Right to the City Alliance, the grassroots community organizing groups. In addition to folks like Deborah with Boston Impact and others, we sort of came together, folks at the Himes Foundation, like we've come together to sort of build this new piece of movement infrastructure that allows for communities to not only control capital, but drive finance toward projects that are actually manifesting the things we're fighting for in the dominant economy. So for example, Ujima has, we went through a year-long process with like literally over like 35 community meetings and multiple assemblies, where people defined our community standards, what we're calling sort of the Ujima Good Business Certification. It's sort of our own version of B Corp, right? But what's really interesting is like, because we have these grassroots movement folks that are in the space and defining what the standards are, we've come out with some amazing and I think unique things. Like every business, if you want to get investment from Ujima, has to be a sanctuary business committing not to call ICE on their workers. We've set a 5-to-1 highest to lowest paid scale ratio, for example, for any company. You have to be friendly towards people with criminal records and make sure that you're not discriminating against, right? So if you're a restaurant, you can't pay sub minimum wage. Like all these different fights that our grassroots groups are fighting to enforce in the dominant economy, we already have businesses that are doing this in our own neighborhoods, but we haven't been able to sort of resource and uplift them, not only so they can survive, because it's hard to do these things competing on a capitalist market, but also because these businesses can help build political power and sort of model the future so that when we're fighting for legislation, we can point to the companies that are already doing it as a sort of counterpoint to the traditional, and I think it's kind of crazy how like small business has been sort of co-opted by multinational corporate interests. Like in Massachusetts, like we have the Associated Industries of Massachusetts, which is a fairly conservative business network that supposedly represents small businesses. But I would argue that if you're a small business owner in a low-income community of color, like your interests are more aligned with the people in that community, if that's where you're from and that's where you live and you care about your workers, than with the, Walmarts of the world, for example. And so, I guess I just say all that because there's a real kind of concrete value in what Ujima is trying to do now that I think helps build social movement power that allows us to contest in the broader economy. And like, we don't have illusions about scale. So like Ujima is a small project. It's taken us years just to get to launch. $5 million for communities is significant, but in the scale of finance, it's negligible, right? And so people often ask us, like, what's the long game here? And for us, really, at least for myself, like, there's a few things. I mean, I want Ujima to be successful and do this round of investment well, and to be able to raise a larger fund if that's what communities want to do. We also want to help other communities sort of replicate the democratic investment process in their own places. But I think for me, like the kind of scale that we're ultimately looking for is actually, how do you think about democratizing finance more broadly, right? Like Ujima is our own little construct that we voluntarily come together with, but how about like the pension funds? How about the public dollars, right? And our theory is that as you get people involved in sort of self-governing their own capital, then they start to ask, well, why can't we do this with our tax dollars, for example, right? And so what's been really cool is we just actually had 2 months ago, Ujima and CED and a group called the Corrections Accountability Project helped launch sort of a citywide network that we're calling the Divest Reinvest Network. And this is sort of part of the broader like just transition framework in some ways. And what we're talking about is like, how do you get the city not only to pull its capital, whether it's from the treasury or it's from the pension funds, out of death and destruction, whether it's in the private prison sector, fossil fuels, militarization, occupation, any number of these extractive industries, and reinvesting into communities. And what's been really cool is like Ujima has helped sort of enliven what that possibility could be. And then we actually just had a public hearing last week. Our close friend, Councilor Lydia Edwards, amongst other awesome counselors, sponsored this hearing. And we were able to bring this network together to come testify at the city. And actually kind of preempting the hearing, the mayor actually made an announcement, the city of Boston made an announcement that they were going to be moving $150 million into ESG investing in public equities. But actually, in my opinion, much more significant is the $100 million they also committed to investing into community banks, right? And to local direct investing. And my hope, and there's still a lot of work, and we've been claiming the victory, and I'm reminded of the quote that we ought not claim easy victories. And so I want to kind of hold both of those truths. So part of the struggle then was to say, okay, you committed $100 million, but what are the terms of that capital? And will they be flexible enough to actually be able to invest in a thing like Ujima or the Co-op Fund in New England or Boston Impact Initiative or any of the other sort of local community investment vehicles that we have? I think what was amazing was just like people coming out to this hearing demanding that money comes back into our communities. And part of the reason that was able to happen was because we've been advancing this ethic that like people should control capital, not politicians or CEOs, right? And so that for me is really like, a lot of the work that we're doing, we're still, I recognize the lineage that we're in, but in this particular moment in time, our projects are still small and nascent. And I think what we need to be thinking, I really see these as like demonstration projects, right? And that's maybe the other thing I'll just say is like, I think we need to be really clear about what we're doing at this moment in time. And so for me, like these different projects that we're building are to help people see what's possible and to have real immediate economic and political and cultural benefit for people's lives who deserve to own their own businesses, to have good jobs, to breathe clean air, for example. And we have to understand that so long as we're operating under the current market conditions and you have to compete against the Amazons and the Walmarts of the world, right, that ultimately we can never truly like scale in the way that I think there's a misconception in the impact investing space. I would argue that like, all we need to do is get flexible and non-extractive finance into the businesses that we want to build. And that alone is going to allow them to sort of flourish. Like, I think that is absolutely necessary and a prerequisite, but entirely insufficient. Like we need to be revising the market conditions or even rethinking the very function of markets so that you're not put in a place where you have to constantly be competing. Like we often talk about like, even if every worker-owned business, even if every company in the world was a worker-owned business, right? If you're still operating in a competitive market and need to turn a profit to outcompete your competition, right? The same dynamics of like, even if you're a worker-owner, you could sort of devalue your labor, or of course, like the drives to extract from the environment. I mean, actually, like I think Mondragon is a really good example where like Mondragon has been, for me, such an important and instructive model, right? That's helped inspire so many of us. But we also know the ways in which they have been, fairly traditional and extractive in their non-Spain-based industry. So they're manufacturing.
Just tell people what Mondragon is, just for.
Oh, sure, yeah. Mondragon is the largest worker-owned business in the world. It's based in the Basque region of Spain and comes out of resistance against the Franco regime. And what's, I don't quite know the numbers, but I think it's had up to 90,000 employees, over 250 different worker-owned companies. And what's really cool about what they've done, just to take the detour, is like they have their own university, they have their own bank, and they've also used those infrastructure to sort of do vertical integration across their own supply chains, which has helped them sort of build this like little empire of like amazing worker ownership, right? So it's been really, and I think it's like the 7th largest corporation in Spain. So it's like nothing to sneeze at. It's a very important model for all of us. And like, it's also sort of a warning, right? That even as you get this large and this successful, you're still competing on this global capitalist market, and it's forcing them to do things that I don't want to speak for them, but like from my standpoint, isn't in alignment with the beautiful world that they've been creating in their own communities, right? And so for me, like impact investing is a prerequisite to have better conditions, like less extractive terms, but like ultimately it's about cultural and political transformation that then enables the things that we're trying to seed at this particular moment in time to become the norm. And that for me is sort of the sort of distinction that I've been sort of, that's become more clear for me as I've been sort of moving from being in the grassroots community organizing space and finding myself, in the impact investing community at large.
And it seems like that is, have you read the Winners Take All book on Securitas?
Yeah, I listened to it on audiobook. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so did I. What would you say about, because he really advocates for like re-engagement at the policy level for more systemic solutions. How would you contrast that with something like Ujima, which is sort of like government's not doing its job, so we'll just create our own thing? And it almost seems like in the book he's trying to say like we shouldn't be doing that. We should be more engaging government. But I don't know. Maybe that's not mutually exclusive. But I'm curious how you see that fitting.
Right. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I think what he was saying, his general, well, first of all, he's like, who's making these decisions? How do you have the people who are lighting the fires become the firefighters, right? And so I think that is a very valid critique of impact finance capital. But the very premise of Ujima is to say the people who have been extracted from the communities who have generated the wealth and have had it taken away are now the ones who are making the decisions. So, I think that's the sort of the core thrust of his thesis. And I think that we are like a very important kind of model to sort of reflect that alternative back to him. And he cites, for example, our friends at the Working World, which is an international worker cooperative lending that sort of pioneered this term, non-extractive finance, and Ujima is part of their national network. So my sense is that I don't think he has any problems with people sort of self-determining their own economy. And I think, what you're pointing to, though, is absolutely right, that that is, and that's kind of what I was saying earlier, it's entirely insufficient, right? It's the reason we're doing it is to show what's possible, but ultimately this has to become the norm. It can't just be private, voluntary projects that we're doing alone. There needs to be law and legislation that enable these things and shifts in institutions and culture that make these things normal. And just to take that a little bit further, because I do come out of like the traditional organizing, doing lots of policy work, passing policies at city and state levels. And, I think what's been interesting for us is we've really started grappling with like, okay, so we are doing all these sort of like voluntary private sector models, right? But what would it look like to actually integrate these into municipal governance? And I think there's some, exciting stuff around the world and even in the US where this sort of municipal organizing is bubbling up. And so what we've been able to do with the Center for Economic Democracy is we held a study series with a lot of the prominent leading activists in our communities and grassroots organizers to actually start considering what would a rewrite of the municipal constitution in Boston look like, right? And going back to sort of the thing I was talking about, participatory budgeting earlier, like that for me is one example of how do you integrate democratic governance into the bones of the government, right? Of the bones of the economy. But like we were exploring all kinds of things, like what would a democratically elected police oversight commission with subpoena power look like? Like the last actual constitutional reform we had in Boston was eliminating an elected school board. So like what would it look like to sort of re-democratize our public school system, not only at the sort of board level, but also having parent, teacher, student governance at the school site level, for example. And then, of course, on the economic side, like I think the biggest fight for us right now is the crisis of displacement and gentrification that is really ravaging communities in Boston. And so a large part of that is sort of who gets to decide what gets developed in our communities and under what terms. We have our agency called the BPDA, that's basically not accountable really even to the city government. They're sort of their own quasi-public-private, entity. And so for us, we're calling for the abolition of the BRA and sort of the creation of neighborhood councils and sort of community government infrastructure where people can decide how they want to use city land, right? The last example I'll give, well, we've been talking about a municipal public bank. So that was part of our, like, if we actually want to control finance, like we need the institutions instead of like outsourcing it to Bank of America, we should internalize these functions. And then, and that's sorry to kind of be all over the place, but like, we know the North Dakota model of public banking that's been really important in some ways, but it's not a democratically governed vehicle, right? And so for us, like we're sort of trying to model democratic governance of finance and then pushing for policies that would then create and institutionalize these kinds of strategies within the public sector so that then in the future, not only do we want a municipal public bank, but we want it to actually be accountable to the communities that it's supposed to be serving. The last one I'll give is like, we were doing participatory budgeting on one side, but I thought what was really interesting working with the young people are like, hey, it's cool. We're interested in doing a feasibility study on a skate park, but like, who gets to actually build the skate park? Like who gets the jobs, right? And I think it's an interesting opportunity to think about democratizing municipal contracting. So we just made it up, but we've been calling it sort of democratic contracting or participatory procurement. And what's I think really important about this is like, I think there is like, I don't want to give too much credence, but there's like a validity to some of the right-wing libertarian critiques of public sector services, right? There's a lot of public sector services that are excellent, but there are times when you're at the RMV or just like, or, your local trash hauler just keeps on knocking the mirror off of your car door or something. Like there are times in which there's a sense of like, I have no control over these very important services that are supposed to be on my behalf, but there's no recourse, right? And so their solution is obviously the privatization and sort of like putting into the private sector, which I think is a horrible idea because the whole point of the public sector is you're at least able to guarantee some baseline, whereas in the private sector, it's basically if you have the money, you can have it. If you don't, you're asked out, basically. Just to close the loop on that thought, like while there is a valid critique of the lack of responsiveness of the public sector, and again, the right-wing sort of approach to it is privatization, our approach is like, and I think it's funny because there's this myth of capitalism that people vote with their money, right? But if you have more money, then you have more votes. And so for us, we're actually saying, like, why don't we let just people vote on who gets the contract? So every 3 years, like when you renew your contracts for who gets the trash hauling contract, like why can't community residents say, yeah, I'm okay with the same business getting it again, right? Like, or even taking one step further, like why couldn't communities set the terms for who gets those contracts? So not only, yeah, we need someone to pick up our trash, but we want it to be a worker-owned company. We want it to be green. We want it to be predominantly people of color in our own communities, for example, right? And so like there's so many decision-making points within municipal governance that if we could sort of pivot our thinking to sort of democratize them, and we could sort of embed those in the foundational sort of legal and juridical documents, the sort of foundations of what a city is, it doesn't mean that we're always going to win, right? Because you could have a very democratic society and have deep inequality and people make bad decisions. Like that can certainly happen. But our belief is that actually the things that we're striving for, right, equity and justice, are things that the vast majority of people want. And so if we can create democratic institutions, it enables us to advance our progressive agenda in a very different way, and allows us to actually move from contestation to self-governance, which I think is, going all the way back to the beginning. Like that's our right as human beings, as dignified people with divinity within us, right? Like if you believe that you have expansive knowledge and truth inside of you, and that we have the impulse for being productive actually deeply within us, and to meet our own collective needs and to take care of each other, then yes, of course, we should be structuring government in a way that allows for people to exercise that truth. And so that for me is like, again, it's not just about policy and just sort of winning progressive reforms, but it's about how are you baking in the spaces for democratic self-governance so that we don't have to keep fighting over the policies over and over, if that makes sense. Or at least we're fighting over these with our own communities. It's a dialogue, as opposed to currently, which is we're outside of the system. The multinational corporations have essentially seized control of the nation state, or even beyond that, and we're sort of like contesting against them. We want to sort of take those hard decisions that have to be made in governance, but internalizing them and engaging ourselves and sort of making tough choices. And not all just last thing I'll say on that is like, I think Ujima is a really good example of us creating space for people to make these choices. So like, I remember doing this spectrogram activity, which is like you stand, if you agree, then you stand on one side of the room. If you disagree, you stand on the other side of the room. And we're asking people like, if you're an investor in this, what's more important for you to make a return that's sizable, or for us to make capital available at an affordable rate for the businesses that we want to invest in, right? That's a choice that investors get to make on their own. Now we're sort of visibilizing that tension, because it's a real tension, and then asking people to make that choice for themselves. And, in our case, I was very pleased that people, they don't want to lose their money. But for the most part, what people care about is actually helping seed the beautiful alternatives that so many of our community members are trying to build. And they see over and over how capital is a barrier to that, because they can't even get access, or it's too expensive. And so, those kinds of choices, though, if you leave it to the capitalist class, like they're going to make, for the most part, the self-interested choice every time. And then, of course, we have like a small segment of people with wealth and power who have sort of defected and are kind of class traders, and they're kind of on that side. But for the most part, like that's not a theory of change to just hope that we're going to be able to peel off enough people. Like, no, the way this is going to change is that people are going to force change. And that for me is, I think, going back to, the winner take all book, like that's part of the premise too, of like, we can't ask people to self-regulate against their own self-interest, which is what I think the sort of impact investing space writ large is sort of holding up as a model that I think is actually fairly delusional.
Yeah. And, I think a critical element that you bring is both knowledge of grassroots organizing and movement building in addition to business. And I think many listeners, and this is a wild guess, but I think many listeners of this podcast are more on the like, I'm a social entrepreneur, and the way that I create change in the world is through offering goods or services that are like, better or more environmentally friendly, or I pay my workers good wages. And I think that model has been up until Trump being elected or whatever has been like good enough, I guess, for folks. But I think that there's a bigger gap. Like, I think the big gap in like the progressive, majority white upper middle class business community is like just voting for Obama, being open-minded, and donating money at the end of the year, and then like paying your workers well, and like providing an environmentally product. That's like not enough to really change the world anymore, or it never was.
Right.
And so can you talk a little bit about like what are the grassroots activist like movement building piece that like more traditional like social entrepreneurs are missing? Right.
Well, I want to just start by saying like all those things are so important, right? So like if we're not doing these things, then we have no chance. And I also want to just acknowledge how hard it is to run a small business, to run a social enterprise. And like, I think it's funny because like on the community organizing side, like we don't know all the trials and tribulations it is to be a small business owner. And I think similarly, there's sort of a opaqueness from the social enterprise side about what's happening in the community organizing sector, which is part of your question. And so I think the core piece again that I want to just sort of bring it back to the question of power, right? Like who has power in society and who's able to exercise their will to meet their own desires, right? And right now, there's lots of different kinds of power, but the ones that we talk about often are sort of cultural power, political power, and economic power. And I think what's interesting is like the community organizing sector, for the most part, is focused on building political and if we're doing it well, cultural power, but haven't necessarily figured out how to wield economic power in a strategic way. And then meanwhile, you have the social enterprise sector, and like just like in our communities, we have small business owners. Black, Indigenous, people of color own companies, and folks who grew up in Boston. And they have a lot of the sort of political alignment with what the grassroots groups are doing, but like the economic power isn't being leveraged, for example, to advance policy, right? So like I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I just, to take your question into this space, like what I'm really interested in, part of the sort of the operating premise of Center for Economic Democracy, when we started sort of exploring this framework like 5-6 years ago and trying to figure out like what our role in this like national ecosystem, both locally and nationally, would be, like what we started to see was like there's a missing opportunity for building power between sectors because they're siloed right now. And so for me, the question is like, how can you as a small business owner, like I love the small business owners that are giving money to the local baseball league, like that's really important, but like how are you actually giving money to the community organizing groups that are fighting for your community, right? Just like that small sort of alignment with the social movement sector. And then how are the community organizing groups actually advancing policies that can make your ability to survive and thrive as small business owner more likely, right? So the example for me in Boston is like, the Amazon thing is a great example around organizing, but like we had GE come into Boston and it's interesting because now they're apparently leaving, but they got a huge tax break. And what we see is like as the grassroots movement groups are the ones that are able to say like, not only is that not acceptable to be giving away money to these multinational corporations, but meanwhile, like why can't we give tax breaks and subsidies to the small businesses in our own communities? Why can't we get procurement contracts from the city government to be driven towards MBEs, for example, right? And then going back to the business side, like how can the businesses think about leveraging, like using their literal physical assets? Like if you're a retail business, so this is an idea that's come up in Ujima also, like you're a small business owner, you have hundreds of people walking through your company every day. Well, during election seasons, like why can't you be a location for voter registration and mobilization, right? Like why can't we leverage and activate our business assets in our communities if we can find that political alignment to add a whole new dimension of power that allows our communities to advance our collective agendas that we all actually share? And so for me, it's like, I'm not telling, it's not about like telling business owners that are trying to do the right thing that's not meaningful or useful. In fact, like often that's the most immediate and useful thing in some ways. But what I'm trying to help people see is the opportunities of seeing ourselves within a aligned ecosystem, right? And the ways in which actually we can help solve our collective, our individual pain points by actually leveraging the assets and the gifts that different actors have in communities. And I do think, it's easier to do in place because like people live in communities, they see each other, they know each other, and you're able to sort of build those relationships. So I think it's also necessary for us to be thinking about, like, at the national scale, how is the social movement organizations like Right to the City or the Climate Justice Alliance or the Takes Roots Network or all these other amazing networks that represent frontline grassroots communities, like how do they start being in conversation with finance capital in a different way so that we can start to explore new strategies that are actually not only just moving money in a positive way to help, build community wealth and struggle against the racial wealth divide, but actually how do we think about the function of finance capital advancing a political agenda? Maybe that's a whole other thing, but for me, it's an inquiry that I'm in right now. We've been sort of playing with this idea of movement portfolio theory, sort of playing and riffing off this idea of the modern portfolio theory, which was simply about, sort of setting your risk and return things and trying to maximize and optimize across asset classes to meet those needs. And then, of course, we've had in the impact investing space, people like Jed Emerson and others who have been thinking about, like, well, it's risk, return, and impact, and sort of building portfolios through that. And what we're kind of adding is like, well, let's be more precise about what we mean by impact and start to actually talk about power instead of impact, right? And I think that sort of changes the framework. So then, like, a lot of large asset owners and investors are doing shareholder activism, for example, right? And I think that's really important. But like, how integrated are those strategies with the broader social movement building campaigns that are out there? Like, how different would it be, for example, for, as opposed to someone who manages the assets of the union and is sort of trying to intervene in a bad corporation, how different would it be if the hundreds of thousands of members of an international union were sort of engaged in deciding what shareholder activist strategies that the asset managers would be advancing, right? Like, how different would it be if there was cultural work happening that was sort of paralleling and reinforcing these different campaigns? Like, I think there's a whole opportunity for us to be, and I want to name my friend Eli at Majority Action has been sort of experimenting with that particular strategy. But like, we've been having, I just was talking with some friends the other day about like, what would, we've been calling it the battle hedge fund strategy, right? So like, we know this sort of a just transition framework is about like fighting the old and building the new. Could we be shorting the old, applying political pressure? So for example, can you short private prison stock, right? We just saw, I think JP Morgan Chase just had a big announcement about divesting from private prisons or something, right? Like, so how do we think about shorting private prisons, shorting fossil fuels, and then going long on renewables? Like, and then using our shareholder activism to make sure our long positions are ones that are better reflecting and actually becoming the future that we want. And like, honestly, like, I don't work in public equities. I don't really know this stuff, but what's obvious to me is like, there's a lot of untapped opportunities with people who want to be useful, right? Like, I think a lot of the folks in the sort of traditional impact investing space, like, are beautiful, loving, and brilliant folks. But I think what's the missing piece is the connection to social justice movements and people on the ground building community power. And I think if we could sort of bridge these different spaces, the possibilities for interventions and the kinds of new power that we can build could be unstoppable, or that's my hope anyway.
I love it. Yeah, and I think for me, I've been really interested in like I think the first step, at least for many white people, is understanding whiteness in order to like understand how to help. Like, it's great to go organize with low income communities of color, but if you don't understand whiteness and like what you're bringing, because we have the privilege as white people to like never really have to even think about it. It's just considered the dominant worldview. Then I think there's gonna be some big gaps in like what we're able to achieve. So that's the lens I've been holding and really interested in.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I also think like, I mostly have been centering low income and working class communities of color, but I think for more privileged white folks, like, I think one of the biggest gaps in our social justice ecosystem is like support for all the white communities that have also been ravaged and devastated by neoliberalism, right? And I think in some ways, like, I don't want to get too down the like what happened with Trump rabbit hole, but like, I do think one of the ways that white people who want to be in anti-racist solidarity, like with communities of color, is to actually be engaging other white people across class, right? And I think that in itself is also complicated because a white person with privilege and class privilege, like trying to support and work in poor or working class white communities, that's a whole level of privilege that needs to be negotiated also. But what's clear for, those of us who are doing work in communities of color or people of color, like that's not necessarily the work that we can do, right? But it needs to be happening. And so whether it's you're actually, embedding yourself and living in communities and really like, and I think part of what's the struggle of people who are going through the process of understanding whiteness and struggling with it is then they want to separate themselves from the bad white people, right? I'm the good white person that I'm now woke, and those are the people that I'm not like. And I get that impulse. And that goes back to some of the shame and the guilt and like why understanding history and sort of acknowledging what we've inherited wasn't always our choices, right? But I think that's like people have to push past that, right? Because that is like, I think that's a very self-serving and unfortunately like collectively self-defeating attitude. Like, yeah, it's not comfortable, but it's the work that needs to happen. And I would much rather have people not being the most eloquent about being able to articulate how woke they are and how anti-racist they are versus struggling and being in communities, talking to in their extended family, like all that work that we know is so important. So I do think that's starting to happen more. Like I know last holiday season was like tough work for a lot of folks on our side, like having those tough conversations in their families and communities, but like I don't see any other way. And there is a role for everyone in this movement.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is like sometimes the progressive, like I have like one conservative uncle. And so I was going home to Christmas and being like, well, I guess I don't really have to like combat with people about like, identifying white fragility. But then it's like, of course, all the progressive white people are like, that doesn't apply to me. It's sort of like the Northern mindset. Like I didn't have anything to do with slavery, even though our whole economy was based on it.
Right. Economy was based on it. That's right.
Yeah. So I think sometimes progressive white folks have sort of a huge blind spot around like what baggage we're bringing to the table. And it's like you said, it's not it's not like there's only conservative. It's not like only the conservative racists caused Trump. I think a lot of progressive white people caused Trump too.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
So maybe in the last few minutes here, Aaron, is one question is, what do you need right now, and how can listeners help you grow the next economy?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's about helping me grow the next economy. It's like what are the things that we all need to be doing in our own communities and the places that we have access. And so, honestly, I think I've listened to like every podcast that you've put out there. It's been like amazing to get to hear the diversity of stories. And I think like part of it is like we need to become messengers in the ways that we can, whatever communities that we're in. And to, like, how do we get people to see this body of work as their own? And I think it is hard. Like, this is something that I struggle with. Like, I'm kind of a heady person and I try to really push myself to make sure that like, we're not alienating people as we talk about theory. But like, for me, I fundamentally believe that people get this stuff at a gut level. And that we actually, in some ways, need to get out of the way to allow communities to sort of like exert the truths that they already have. So, that's a pretty sort of broad notion, but I do appreciate the question in a very specific way. Right now we're in the process of raising a capital fund. It's the first with Ujima. It's the first investment fund that's democratically allocated, as far as we know, in the country. And we are taking investors. So, if not accredited investors, you have to be in Massachusetts or some of the New England states. But obviously for institutional philanthropy, for accredited investors, we can take capital from anywhere in the US, UK, and Canada right now. And so, we would invite people. We're trying to raise $5 million, and it's going to be a learning experience, right? We hope people come at it from the perspective of like inquiry and excitement and hopefully some hope, but sort of recognizing that this is something that we're building as we go and to sort of accompany us in this journey. And those are the kinds of investors that we're really excited about. But I think, for me more generally, like I would implore people to, if you're coming out of a more social enterprise or sort of business side part of the world, to start asking like, well, are there social justice groups in my own community that I haven't connected with? Like, I'm already, for example, practicing great environmental practices in my company. Well, is there an environmental justice group that fights against environmental racism that I could start connecting with and building relationships with? I think across the board, there's opportunities for us to break through our silos. And that for me is really like the work in the intervention that Center for Economic Democracy is trying to offer is to really help recognize the wholeness of ourselves and begin to align the different parts of our infrastructure, whether it's in the business, investment, cultural, political spaces, to sort of realign those so that we're no longer divided, but actually, building a movement for long-term transformation.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.